Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let's just settle in. Tonight, we're going to spend a very long time talking about the strange, often itchy, and occasionally toxic world of medieval beauty standards. Because, as it turns out, the quest to look enchanting back then usually involved a lot of lead, some questionable uses for leeches, and a very dedicated commitment to looking like a sentient egg. So, take a deep breath, forget about the modern world for a while, and let's just drift back into the Middle Ages. To understand medieval beauty, you first have to understand that it wasn't really about fashion in the way we think of it today. It was more of a moral obligation. If you were beautiful, it was generally assumed you were a good person. If you were, let's say, acoustically challenged in the face department, people genuinely worried about the state of your soul. No pressure, right? We'll start our journey with the forehead. Now, in the modern day, we spend a lot of money on bangs or hats to maybe minimize the forehead. But in the 1300s and 1400s, the forehead was the main event. A high, wide, domed forehead was considered the ultimate sign of intelligence and noble birth. If you didn't have a naturally massive forehead, you didn't just accept your fate, you fought back. Noble women would spend hours plucking their hairlines back, inch by agonizing inch, sometimes halfway to the crown of their heads. Because nothing says, "I am a refined duchess," quite like a voluntary receding hairline. And of course, they didn't stop at the scalp. Eyebrows were also considered a bit of a nuisance. To achieve that perfect, ethereal, "I have never seen a day of manual labor" look, women would pluck their eyebrows until they were either razor-thin or entirely non-existent. The goal was a face that looked as smooth and uninterrupted as a fresh bowl of porridge. If you looked slightly surprised at all times because you had no eyebrows to emote with, you were doing it correctly. While they were at it, they decided eyelashes were also surplus to requirements. Long, fluttering lashes, the kind we pay $40 for in a tube today, were seen as over-the-top and even a bit sinful. They were too suggestive. So many women plucked those out too. Just imagine, for a moment, the sheer patience required to pluck your own eyelashes in a room lit by a single flickering tallow candle that smells faintly of beef fat. That is the kind of dedication to aesthetic we're dealing with here. Now, let's talk about the skin. If you were a medieval noble, being tan was the ultimate social failure. A tan meant you spent your time outside, probably digging up turnips or chasing goats. To be truly beautiful, you needed to be as pale as a ghost, or, more accurately, as pale as someone who has been locked in a stone tower for 3 weeks. This led to the use of ceruse, which was essentially white lead mixed with vinegar. You'd slather it on your face to get that perfect deathly pallor. Sure, it caused hair loss, skin sores, and eventual lead poisoning, but at least nobody thought you were a peasant who enjoyed the sun. Because why settle for a healthy glow when you can have a literal chemical peel? If the lead didn't get you, the leeches might. It wasn't uncommon for a lady to have a few leeches applied behind her ears before a big feast. The idea was that the leeches would drain just enough blood to make her look suitably frail and faint. It's a very specific vibe. I am so wealthy, I am actively dying of anemia. Let's float over to the hair. While the hairline was being pushed back toward the neck, the hair that remained was a massive deal. If you were a young, unmarried woman, you could wear it down, long, flowing, and ideally blonde. Blonde was the gold standard, mostly because it was rare in many parts of Europe and was associated with angels. If you weren't born blonde, nature could be corrected with a lovely mixture of saffron, onion skins, and, well, sitting in the sun for 8 hours with your hair soaked in acidic wine. Once you got married, though, the hair had to go away. Not literally, but it had to be contained. This is where we get into the realm of the wimple and the hennin. The wimple was essentially a chin strap made of linen that wrapped around the face. It was designed to keep you modest, but it also had the added benefit of hiding any double chins, provided you didn't mind looking like a very fashionable nun. And then came the headdress heights. In the late Middle Ages, the hennin, those tall, cone-shaped hats you see in fairy tales, became the height of sophistication. Some of them were so tall that doors had to be built higher just to accommodate the local countess. They were topped with veils of fine silk or linen that would float behind the woman as she walked, creating a sort of slow-motion effect. It was all very graceful until a stiff breeze caught the veil and nearly snapped the poor woman's neck. But such is the price of grace. We should probably mention the ideal body shape, which changed in ways that are frankly exhausting to keep track of. For a long time, the S-curve was the goal. This involved thrusting the stomach forward and the shoulders back, creating a silhouette that made every woman look like she was about 5 months pregnant. In a world where dynastic survival depended on producing heirs, looking perpetually pregnant was actually considered quite chic. It was the ultimate, I am fertile and therefore useful to the state look. Men, of course, weren't exempt from the weirdness. While they didn't have to pluck their hairlines quite as aggressively, they had their own cross to bear, the poline. These were shoes with toes so long and pointed that they eventually had to be tied to the knees with silver chains, just so the wearer wouldn't trip over his own ego. It was a direct correlation. The longer the toe, the higher the social standing. Because nothing says, I don't work for a living, than wearing shoes that make it physically impossible to walk up a flight of stairs. And let's not forget the codpiece. As tunics got shorter and shorter to show off the legs, which medieval men were very proud of, the codpiece emerged to, well, bridge the gap. It started as a practical bit of fabric and ended as a padded, decorative, and often quite confusing architectural feature of the male wardrobe. It was the medieval equivalent of a lifted truck, a very loud, very padded statement about masculinity that everyone just sort of agreed to pretend was normal.
The hygiene of it all is where things get truly sleepy. There's a common myth that medieval people never bathed. They actually loved baths, they just didn't have the plumbing for it. Wealthy people would have large wooden tubs lined with cloth to avoid splinters, filled with water scented with rose petals or herbs. It sounds lovely until you realize the sheer amount of work it took for the servants to haul that much water. So you'd sit there, soaking in your lukewarm rose water while someone read you poetry, and for a brief moment you didn't smell like a damp wool cloak and wood smoke. But for the face, the cleansers were a bit more intense. To get rid of freckles, which were seen as sun kisses and therefore peasant-like, you might use a wash made of strawberry juice, or, if you were feeling brave, crushed whelks. There's something strangely calming about the image of a medieval noblewoman sitting by a fireplace, carefully dabbing snail juice onto her nose in the hopes of looking more like a marble statue. As we move through the centuries, the standards just keep shifting. One minute you're supposed to have a neck like a swan, the next you're covering it up with stiff ruffs that look like giant lace dinner plates. It was a constant cycle of trying to look as unnatural as possible, because in the Middle Ages, natural was what happened to the people working the fields. Beauty was something you constructed with lead, silk, and a very high tolerance for discomfort. So, as you lay there, just think about those long, pointed shoes clicking on stone floors. Think about the heavy velvet gowns that weighed 40 pounds and smelled of lavender and old sweat. Think about the quiet, flickering, candlelit rooms where people spent hours trying to pluck their eyebrows into oblivion. It was a slow, quiet, and very strange world.
The art of the impossible silhouette. Now, let's drift a little deeper into those quiet, candlelit rooms of the medieval palace, where beauty wasn't just a look, but a test of sheer endurance. We've talked about the high foreheads and the missing eyebrows, but the way they treated the human body itself was perhaps the most exhausting part of the whole ordeal. To be a noblewoman in the 14th century was to essentially opt out of being a biological human and instead attempt to become a living, breathing piece of Gothic architecture. Let's float over to the concept of the perfect posture. In the medieval mind, standing up straight simply wasn't enough. For a high-born lady, the ideal was the S-curve. This involved thrusting the abdomen forward, pulling the shoulders back, and tilting the hips in a way that looked, to modernize, like a very slow-motion gymnastics accident. But back then, this sway-back look was the height of elegance. It suggested a certain delicate fragility, a body so refined it could barely support its own weight. If you looked like you were perpetually about to tip over, you were doing it right. And to maintain this bizarre shape, you weren't wearing lycra or yoga pants. You were encased in layers of heavy wool, linen, and stiffened silk. Some of these ceremonial gowns weighed upwards of 40 or 50 pounds. Imagine trying to maintain a graceful S-shaped glide while carrying a medium-sized dog strapped to your torso. It wasn't about comfort, it was about presence. The weight of the fabric was a literal reminder of your status. Only the truly wealthy could afford to be that physically burdened by their own clothes. Then there's the skin care. We know they loved the pale, ghostly look, but the lengths they went to maintain that undead glow were truly special. If you had a blemish or a freckle, you didn't just reach for concealer, you reached for something much more creative. Freckles were often treated with a wash made of strawberry juice, or, if you were feeling particularly adventurous, crushed whelks and vinegar. There was a belief that the acidity would scrub the peasant-like sun kisses off your face. And if you happened to have a mole, well, in the medieval world, a mole was rarely just a mole. Depending on who you asked, it could be a beauty mark or a witch's mark. To play it safe, many women began using patches. These were tiny pieces of expensive velvet or silk, often cut into shapes like stars, moons, or even tiny horse-drawn carriages, which were glued over the blemish. What started as a way to hide a pimple became a full-blown fashion trend. By the late Middle Ages, a woman's face might look like a small, velvet night sky. It was absurd, it was itchy, and it was considered peak sophistication. But let's talk about the eyes. Toward the end of the medieval period and heading into the Renaissance, there was a quiet obsession with dreamy eyes. To achieve this, women used a concoction derived from the belladonna plant. The name literally means beautiful lady, but the plant is better known as deadly nightshade. They would drop the juice into their eyes to dilate their pupils, making them look perpetually surprised, soulful, and perhaps a bit lost in a trance. The side effects included blurred vision, a racing heart, and eventual blindness, but in the name of looking ethereal in a dim hallway, it was considered a fair trade. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the men of the court. They weren't exactly opting for the rugged look. Medieval male beauty was all about the legs. If a man had well-turned calves, he was halfway to a dukedom. This led to the rise of hose that were so tight they were basically a second skin. To accentuate the masculine silhouette, they wore tunics that got shorter and shorter, eventually necessitating the codpiece. Now, the codpiece is one of those historical items that feels like a collective fever dream. It began as a practical triangular flap of fabric, but evolved into a padded, decorated, and sometimes oversized architectural feature. It was the ultimate statement piece. Some were even used as extra pockets for gold coins or handkerchiefs. It's hard to imagine a serious diplomatic meeting where everyone is wearing a padded silk-covered box on their crotch, but that was the reality of the 15th century power lunch. And we can't forget the shoes, the poulaines. These shoes featured toes so long they sometimes reached 20 inches past the actual foot. They were stuffed with moss or hair to keep them upright. If you were a high-ranking noble, your shoes were so long you literally couldn't walk in a straight line without a specific high-stepping gait. It was a physical manifestation of the idea that I don't have to work, I don't have to run, and I certainly don't have to be practical.
It was the medieval version of the slow walk we see on red carpets today, just with more velvet and a higher risk of tripping over your own dignity. Let's move to the scent of the era. Hygiene is always the big question when we talk about the Middle Ages. While they did bathe more than we give them credit for, the smell of a medieval court was a complex bouquet of wood smoke, old stone, damp wool, and very expensive perfume. Since they didn't have modern deodorants, they carried pomanders. These were decorative metal balls, often made of gold or filigree silver, worn on a chain at the waist. Inside was a ball of ambergris, musk, civet, and dried flower petals. Whenever a nobleman or woman encountered a particularly peasant-adjacent smell, like a muddy street or a poorly ventilated kitchen, they would simply lift the pomander to their nose and inhale the scent of an artificial garden. It was a way of carrying your own private atmosphere with you, a tiny scented bubble that protected you from the harsh realities of the 1300s. Even the children were subjected to this quest for the ideal shape. Newborns were swaddled, wrapped so tightly in linen bandages that they couldn't move their limbs. The logic was that a baby's bones were soft like wax, and if they weren't bound tightly, they would grow up crooked. So these poor royal infants spent the first few months of their lives as tiny immobile mummies, kept in dim rooms to ensure their skin remained as pale as possible. It was a quiet, constrained start to a life that would likely be spent in even more layers of restrictive silk. As you drift further into this monologue, think about the silence of the palace. The floors were often covered in rushes, dried grass, and herbs like lavender or meadowsweet. When you walked, the herbs would crush under your feet, releasing a faint, dusty floral scent into the air. The walls were covered in tapestries to keep out the chill, muffling the sound of footsteps. It was a soft, muffled world where every movement was calculated and every look was curated. The medieval beauty standard, at its heart, was a rejection of nature. They didn't want to look healthy, they wanted to look holy. They didn't want to look active, they wanted to look ascetic. It was a world where you plucked your hair, poisoned your eyes, and wore lead on your skin just to prove you belonged to a higher class of being. It was a slow, deliberate, and often painful performance that lasted from sunrise to sunset.
So, as you lie there, imagine the sun setting over a stone castle. The torches are being lit, casting long, flickering shadows against the tapestries. The heavy velvet curtains are being drawn shut. The lady of the house is finally sitting down at her vanity, peeling off the layers of lead paint and unhooking the 40 pounds of silk. The S-curve is finally relaxed. The long, pointed shoes are kicked off. The world becomes quiet, dark, and finally, for a few hours, natural. The history of beauty is often just the history of how much discomfort we are willing to tolerate to feel special. And in the Middle Ages, they were willing to tolerate a lot. But now those days are long gone. The leeches are back in the ponds, the lead is back in the ground, and the long shoes are just dust in a museum. There is nothing left to do but breathe slowly and let the weight of the day fall away, just like a heavy velvet cloak hitting the floor. The toxic glow and the Habsburg jaw. Now that we've navigated the architectural nightmare of medieval silhouettes and the strange desire to look like a hairless, egg-shaped genius, let's drift even deeper into the specific dynastic disasters where beauty standards met the harsh reality of genetics. As we move from the high Middle Ages into the early Renaissance, the stakes for looking the part became even more desperate, and the methods became, well, significantly more poisonous. Just sink a little further into your blankets and imagine a world where the more powerful you were, the more likely you were to be slowly accidentally killing yourself with your own makeup kit.
Let's float over to the Tudor court, specifically to the later years of Elizabeth I. Now, Elizabeth is the poster child for the toxic glow. As she aged, and after a bout with smallpox left her skin scarred, she doubled down on the Venetian ceruse we mentioned earlier. This wasn't just a light dusting of powder, it was a thick, structural paste of white lead and vinegar. She applied it so heavily that it was said she looked like a marble statue that had been left out in the rain. But here's the thing about lead, it eats your skin. So the more she used it to hide the scars the lead created, which meant she needed even more lead. It was a vicious chemical cycle of vanity. By the end of her life, her skin was reportedly the texture of a dried-up riverbed, and she was losing her hair at an alarming rate. But because she was the queen, nobody told her she looked like a peeling picket fence. Instead, they just copied her. Soon the entire court was wandering around with lead-poisoned faces, experiencing tremors, hair loss, and the vapors, all while congratulating each other on how wonderfully pale they looked. It's a very specific kind of commitment to a trend, dying for the look, quite literally. And then there were the lips. To contrast that deathly white face, you needed a vibrant, I am definitely alive and not a ghost red. This was often achieved using cinnabar, which is essentially mercury sulfide. So you had lead on your forehead and mercury on your lips. If you kissed a Tudor noble, you were basically taking a tour of the periodic table's most dangerous elements. They would sit there, sipping sweetened wine with mercury-stained lips, wondering why they had a constant metallic taste in their mouth and why their teeth were turning black. Speaking of black teeth, we have to talk about the sugar standard. In the 1500s, sugar was the ultimate luxury. It was arriving from the New World and was so expensive that only the elite could afford to rot their teeth with it. Eventually, having black, decayed teeth became a status symbol. It proved you were so wealthy you could afford to eat nothing but candied violets and marzipan. People who couldn't afford sugar would actually use black soot to paint their teeth, just to look like they had a high-end cavity problem. Imagine that, a world where a root canal was a flex. It's the kind of logic that only makes sense if you've been breathing in lead fumes all day. Let's drift across the English Channel now, away from the mercury-lipped Tudors, and look at the Spanish Habsburgs. If the Tudors were about toxic makeup, the Habsburgs were about toxic family trees. They had a very specific beauty standard: keep it in the family. They were so obsessed with maintaining their pure bloodline that they forgot that biology doesn't really work like that. Enter the Habsburg jaw. Because of generations of marrying their own cousins and nieces and aunts, it gets messy. A specific genetic trait began to dominate. Their lower jaws grew longer and longer, and their tongues became so enlarged that many of them struggled to speak or even chew. We see this most famously in Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles. He was the culmination of 200 years of selective breeding that was anything but selective. He was called the Bewitched, but really he was just the inbred. He had a jaw so pronounced that he couldn't close his mouth, which meant he was constantly drooling on his very expensive silk ruffs. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he couldn't even eat a piece of bread without help. And yet, in the portraits of the time, the court painters tried so hard to make it look noble. They painted that jutting chin with such reverence, as if to say, yes, this is exactly what a divinely appointed ruler should look like, a human nutcracker in a velvet doublet. There is a quiet irony in it all. While the common people were probably quite healthy-looking from working outdoors and eating vegetables, the royals were busy becoming genetic experiments. They were fading away in their dark palaces, surrounded by gold and tapestries, struggling to breathe through their narrow royal noses and chew with their oversized royal jaws. It was a world of ugly beauty, where the more deformed and sickly you looked, the more it proved you were part of an ancient, untainted line. Let's think about the fabrics again, because the clothes were getting even more restrictive as the years went by. We move into the era of the farthingale, a hoop skirt made of whalebone or wood. It was designed to make a woman's lower half look like a giant structured bell. It was so wide that women often couldn't sit in chairs with arms. They had to perch on stools or stand for hours, their hips encased in a wooden cage. And then there was the Spanish corset. This wasn't the flexible elastic we think of today. This was a stay made of literal iron or heavy leather. It was designed to flatten the chest into a perfect, rigid plane. The goal was to look like a stiff, upright cylinder. Young girls were put into these from the age of 5 or 6 to train their ribs. It's a very quiet, slow kind of torture, all in the pursuit of a silhouette that looked less like a human and more like a very expensive piece of furniture. As the night gets deeper and the room gets colder, imagine the sound of those iron corsets creaking as the ladies of the court tried to take a deep breath. Imagine the smell of the lead paint mingling with the incense in the royal chapel. It was a life lived in a gilded cage where your own body was something to be conquered, flattened, painted, and displayed. And yet there is something strangely peaceful about the way history remembers them. In the portraits, they look so calm. They aren't smiling, partly because their teeth were black from sugar, and partly because it's hard to smile when you're wearing an iron vest, but they look eternal. They are frozen in their lead paint and their whalebone hoops, forever noble, forever pale, and forever slightly poisoned. The world of royal beauty was a world of illusions. It was a way to hide the fact that they were just people. People with smallpox scars, people with genetic disorders, people who were tired and cooled. By turning themselves into these strange, painted icons, they hoped to convince the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were made of something different than the peasants in the fields, not flesh and blood, but marble and gold. But as we know, the marble eventually cracks and the gold fades. The lead poisoning eventually took its toll, the Habsburg line eventually flickered out, and the giant hoop skirts were eventually folded away into trunks to be eaten by moths. All that's left are these stories, long, slow stories of people who tried very hard to be something other than human. So as you drift off, think about the flickering candles in the Escorial or the drafty halls of Whitehall. Think about the quiet rustle of silk and the soft click of a mercury-stained glass against a table. The world is much simpler now. You don't have to pluck your forehead or wear an iron cage. You can just be. You can just breathe. The history of the world is long and heavy, but tonight it's just a soft murmur in the background of your sleep.
The towering wigs and the Versailles vanity. As the world drifted out of the stiff, ironclad corsets of the Renaissance and into the 17th and 18th centuries, the quest for beauty didn't exactly become more logical. If anything, it became a full-blown theatrical production. We are entering the era of the French court, the age of the Sun King, Louis XIV, and eventually the ill-fated Marie Antoinette. This was a time when beauty was no longer just about your face. It was about how much space you could physically occupy in a room. So, as you pull your covers up a bit higher, imagine the halls of Versailles, vast, echoing and filled with the scent of lavender powder and the faint underlying smell of 1,000 people who haven't showered in a month. Let's float over to the hair. If you think modern hair care is a lot of work, consider the fontange and later the towering pouf. It started relatively small, but by the mid-1700s, a noblewoman's hair was essentially a construction project.
To achieve that massive height, hair wasn't just brushed upward, it was built over a frame made of wire or cork, known as a caul. Then it was slathered in pomade made of beef tallow or lard, yes, essentially pig fat, and heavily dusted with flour or potato starch to turn it white. This created a very specific problem. Since these hairstyles took hours to build, women didn't wash their hair for weeks, and because they were using edible fats and starches, their heads became literal snacks for the local wildlife. It wasn't uncommon for a duchess to have a family of mice living inside her hair. To combat the itching and the uninvited guests, they carried long, thin silver rods called head scratchers. If you saw a lady at a royal ball gently poking a silver rod into her towering white wig, she wasn't just adjusting her pins, she was evicting a rodent. It's a very calm, very elegant image of absolute chaos. The heights reached such extremes that women had to kneel on the floor of their carriages just to fit inside, or they would have to stick their heads out the window like a very fashionable golden retriever. Some wigs were even decorated with entire scenes, miniature gardens, bird cages with mechanical birds, or even models of famous naval ships. It was a world where your head was a stage, and you were just the person carrying it around. The strain on the neck must have been immense, but in the court of Louis XVI, a sore neck was a small price to pay for being the tallest person in the mirror gallery. Now, let's talk about the face again. The pale as a ghost look was still very much in style, but now it was paired with rouge, and not just a light dusting of pink. We're talking about giant, aggressive circles of bright red on the cheeks. This rouge was often made of carmine, or, once again, mercury-based cinnabar. The goal wasn't to look natural. In fact, looking natural was considered offensive. If you looked like a real human being, it meant you were probably a commoner. To be an aristocrat, you had to look like a porcelain doll that someone accidentally dropped in a bucket of white paint and then stamped with red circles. And then there were the mouches, or beauty patches, which reached their peak during this time. These weren't just for hiding smallpox scars anymore. They were a secret language. If you placed a patch near your eye, it meant you were passionate. If you placed it on your right cheek, it meant you were married. On the corner of the mouth, that meant you were coquettish. A lady could carry a whole conversation without saying a word, just by moving a tiny piece of black silk around her face. It was the 18th century version of an emoji, only much more expensive and likely to fall off into your soup. Let's drift down to the grand habit, the court dress. If the medieval dresses were heavy, these were architectural feats. The panier, or side hoops, became so wide that a woman could be 6 feet wide from hip to hip, while being only 10 inches thick from front to back. To get through a door, you had to turn sideways and shuffle. It was a physical manifestation of power. If you are so wide that no one can stand within 3 feet of you, you are by definition the center of attention. But beneath all that silk and wire, the reality was a bit grimy. King Louis XIV famously only took about 3 full baths in his entire life, on the advice of his doctors who thought water opened the pores to disease. Instead, the royals would wash by rubbing their skin with a dry cloth or a cloth soaked in alcohol. They would change their linen shirts several times a day, believing that the clean linen would absorb the dirt from their skin. So you had these incredibly ornate, jewel-encrusted people who probably smelled of a mix of old sweat, expensive musk, and the faint scent of a dry cleaner's. To mask this, they used toilet water, scented vinegars and perfumes that were so strong they could probably be smelled from the next province. Imagine a dinner party at Versailles. You're sitting there in your 5-foot wide skirt, your hair is 3 feet tall and smells faintly of flour and lard, your face is coated in white lead and red mercury, and you're trying to eat a delicate piece of pheasant when your corset is so tight you can only take shallow sips of air. It was a life of constant, low-level physical distress, all performed with a look of bored indifference. Because that was the ultimate beauty standard of the French court, nonchalance. You had to look like all of this. The hair, the lead, the wire cages was completely effortless. If you looked like you were struggling, you were a failure. You had to glide across the parquet floors as if you were floating, even though your shoes had 4 inches heels and your dress weighed as much as a small child. As the 18th century drew to a close, the standards began to shift towards a pastoral look. Think Marie Antoinette playing to be a shepherdess. But even natural was artificial. They wore simple muslin dresses that actually cost more than the silk ones, and they wore wigs that were designed to look like messy natural hair, which took even longer to style than the tall ones. It was a never-ending game of pretend. The tragedy, of course, is that while they were busy deciding where to place their beauty patches and how much flour to put in their hair, the world outside the palace gates was changing. The people were hungry, and they didn't care about the language of beauty patches or the height of a wig. When the revolution finally came, all those towering hairstyles and lead-painted faces became symbols of everything that was wrong with the old world. But tonight, we don't have to worry about the revolution. We are just observers in the long, slow parade of history. As you lie there, think about the quiet rustle of those massive silk skirts as they brushed against the golden walls of Versailles. Think about the soft click-clack of high heels on marble. Think about the tiny silver head scratchers and the smell of lavender water. It was a world that was beautiful, toxic, absurd, and incredibly quiet in its own way. The lights in the great gallery are flickering out. The king has retired to his bed, and the courtiers are finally unpinning their 3-foot hairstyles. The white powder is falling like snow onto their shoulders. The heavy hoops are being lifted off. The world is becoming small and soft and dark again. There is no more need for rouge or patches or wire frames. There is only the cool air, the soft pillow, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing.
The romantic death and Victorian sickly chic. As we drift away from the powdered chaos of the French Revolution and the towering wigs of Versailles, the world slows down into a much more somber, quieter, and, frankly, stranger era of beauty. We've arrived at the 19th century, the Victorian Age. If the previous eras were about occupying space and looking like a colorful porcelain doll, the Victorians decided to pivot in the opposite direction. They became obsessed with a look that we might call the romantic death. So, as you settle deeper into your blankets, imagine a world of heavy velvet curtains, the ticking of a grandfather clock, and a beauty standard that favored looking as though you were just about to expire. In the mid-1800s, the ultimate beauty icon wasn't a healthy athlete, it was the invalid. Because of the prevalence of tuberculosis, then known as consumption, the physical symptoms of the disease actually became the height of fashion. Consumption was thought to be a romantic way to go, supposedly heightening one's artistic sensitivity. It made you pale, it made your eyes bright and dilated with fever, and it made your skin almost translucent. Women who were perfectly healthy began to go to great lengths to mimic the look of a terminal illness. To get that feverish glow in the eyes, they went back to our old friend belladonna, dropping the poison into their eyes until they could barely see the person they were talking to. To achieve the hollow-cheeked, fragile look,
They would drink vinegar or lemon juice to settle their appetites and avoid any hint of vulgar health. It was a world where a rosy, sun-kissed cheek was a sign of a common laborer, but a pale, gaunt face with dark circles under the eyes suggested a poetic soul. You weren't just a woman, you were a tragic heroine in a Gothic novel, waiting for a storm to break over a moor. But the pursuit of this sickly chic didn't stop at vinegar. This was the era of the arsenic wafer. Yes, actual arsenic. Companies sold Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, promising to remove freckles, pimples, and muddiness from the skin. And it worked in a terrifying way. Arsenic destroys red blood cells, which gives the skin a ghostly porcelain whiteness. Of course, it also causes hair loss, kidney damage, and eventual death, but at least your skin looked great in the casket. It's the ultimate irony of the Victorian age. They were so afraid of looking unrefined that they literally poisoned themselves to look like they were already dead. Let's float over to the Victorian silhouette. We've moved away from the wide hoops of the French court and into the era of the crinoline and then the bustle. The crinoline was a massive cage made of steel hoops that could reach up to 6 feet in diameter. Unlike the French hoops, which were flat, these were round. They were so light and bouncy that a gust of wind could literally pick a woman up and toss her across a park. But the real danger was fire. In a world lit by open hearths and candles, a 6-foot-wide dress made of highly flammable gauze and lace was essentially a walking torch. Thousands of women died when their dresses brushed against a fireplace. But the fashion remained. Why? Because it made the waist look tiny by comparison. The goal was the hourglass, and to achieve it, they returned to the corset with a vengeance. The Victorian corset was a masterpiece of engineering and suffering. It wasn't just about support, it was about tight lacing. Some women aimed for a 16-inch waist, roughly the size of a large grapefruit. This didn't just move the fat around, it actually shifted the internal organs. Lungs were squashed, livers were compressed, and fainting became so common that every Victorian parlor had a fainting couch. It wasn't that Victorian women were naturally fragile or prone to the vapors, they just couldn't take a full breath of oxygen. Imagine trying to live your life while someone is constantly pressing their hands against your ribs with all their might. That was just a Tuesday for a Victorian lady. And then there was the hair. While they moved away from the lard-filled wigs of the 1700s, the Victorians became obsessed with long hair. It was seen as a woman's crowning glory. If a woman let her hair down and it didn't reach her floor, she felt inadequate. This led to the Sutherland sisters vibe, women who had hair 7 feet long. But because washing hair was still a massive chore that involved cold water and harsh lye soap, they didn't do it often. Instead, they used hair rats, balls of their own shed hair collected from their brushes to pad out their buns and braids, making their hair look thicker than it was. Your hairstyle was essentially a recycling project. It was heavy, it was hot, and it was pinned in place with dozens of sharp metal pins. By the end of the day, the relief of taking out those pins was probably the closest thing to heaven a Victorian woman could experience. Let's think about the colors of the era. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, and with it came aniline dyes. The most famous was Shields green, a vibrant, beautiful emerald green that was used for everything from ball gowns to wallpaper. The secret ingredient? Arsenic, again. Women would wear these emerald green dresses and break out in sores. The people making the dresses in the factories would get sick and die. Even the people living in rooms with green wallpaper were being slowly poisoned by the dust. It was a world where beauty was quite literally vibrant and deadly. You could be dancing in a ballroom, looking like a forest sprite in your green silk, while the very fabric on your back was leaching poison into your skin. As the 19th century wound down, the Gibson girl emerged, a slightly more athletic, healthier look. But even that was a construction. The Gibson girl had a massive S-bend corset that pushed the chest forward and the hips back, creating a silhouette that looked like the person was about to snap in half. It was a never-ending cycle of trying to force the human body into shapes that nature never intended. As you lie there, listen to the imaginary quiet of a Victorian evening. The coal fire is glowing in the grate. The heavy velvet curtains are blotting out the fog of the city. The lady of the house is finally unlacing. She's taking off the heavy bustle, unpinning the hair rats, and washing the arsenic powder off her face with rose water. The constriction is gone. The heart can finally beat at its normal rhythm. The lungs can finally expand. The Victorian era was a time of deep contradictions. They were obsessed with morality and purity, yet they wore clothes that were dangerous and used makeup that was lethal. They loved the natural world, but did everything they could to distort their natural bodies. It was a slow, dignified, and very carefully controlled performance. But now the fog has cleared. The arsenic wafers are long gone. The steel crinolines have been recycled into bridges and buildings. The world of the tragic, pale invalid has faded into the light of the modern day. You don't have to be a tragic heroine. You don't have to hold your breath. You can just sink into the softness of your bed, knowing that the only standard you have to meet tonight is that of a deep, peaceful sleep. The clock on the mantel is ticking slower and slower. The fire has turned to embers. The stories of the plucked, the painted, and the poisoned are over. The history of beauty is a long, strange road. But tonight, that road ends right here at the edge of your dreams.
The modern break and the dawn of the industrial doll. As we drift away from the arsenic-scented drawing rooms of the Victorian era, the world begins to pick up a bit of speed. The heavy velvet fog of the 19th century is lifting, replaced by the electric hum of the early 20th century. This is the era where the ancient world of beauty finally breaks. If you've spent the last few hours imagining yourself encased in whalebone and lead, you can finally take a deep breath. We are entering the age of the flapper, the Hollywood starlet, and the moment beauty stopped being a royal secret and started becoming a global industry. So settle in, adjust your pillow, and let's watch the old world crumble as a new, equally strange one takes its place. The transition began with a man named Paul Poiret, who famously claimed he had liberated the female body by declaring the death of the corset. But as with everything in history, liberation came with a catch. As the rigid steel cages of the Victorians were tossed into the scrap heap, the beauty standard shifted from structural to athletic. Suddenly, for the first time in centuries, women were allowed to have ribs that actually expanded. But in place of the corset came a new, perhaps more demanding master, the diet. In the 1920s, the flapper look became the obsession. The goal was to look like a teenage boy. Flat chest, straight hips, and short bobbed hair. After 1,000 years of trying to look like a fertile S-curve or a wide-hipped matron, women were now trying to disappear. They wore binders to flatten their chests and dresses that hung like tubes of silk. It was a radical, rebellious look, but it was also the beginning of the modern obsession with youth. For the first time, looking mature was a social death sentence. You had to look like you were perpetually 19, dancing the Charleston until dawn on a diet of cigarettes and bathtub gin. And then there was the hair. For centuries, a woman cutting her hair was a sign of disgrace or mourning. In the 1920s, it was an act of war. The bob was the ultimate symbol of the modern woman. But since most hairstylists only knew how to pile hair up, women had to go to male barbershops to get their hair shorn. Imagine the quiet, rhythmic snip-snip of the barber's shears as centuries of crowning glory fell to the floor in heaps.
It was lighter, it was easier, but it required permanent waves, which in the early days involved being hooked up to a machine that looked like a giant electric octopus. You would sit for hours with metal clamps on your head, praying the electricity wouldn't singe your scalp. It was the birth of industrialized beauty, beauty that required a machine and a socket. Let's float over to the face, which was changing just as fast. This is the era where makeup finally lost its deadly reputation and became cosmetics. Max Factor, a man who worked for the Russian Royal Ballet before moving to Los Angeles, began creating makeup for the silver screen. Suddenly, women didn't want to look like pale Victorian ghosts. They wanted to look like movie stars. They wanted the Cupid's bow lip, a tiny heart-shaped mouth painted on with a stencil, and they wanted mascara. But early mascara wasn't the easy tube we have today. It was a hard cake of wax and pigment that you had to spit on and apply with a tiny brush. There's something strangely intimate and slightly gross about the world's most glamorous women spitting into a tin of black soot just to make their eyelashes pop. And while they weren't using as much lead as Queen Elizabeth, they were still using kohl and early eyeliners that weren't exactly organic. The smoky eye was born here, intended to make the eyes look huge and sad on a black and white film screen. It was a look designed for the camera, not for the daylight, yet millions of women wore it to the grocery store anyway. But perhaps the most shocking shift of the early 20th century was the tan. For the entirety of recorded history, from ancient Rome to the French court, a tan was the mark of a peasant. It meant you worked in the sun. But in the 1920s, Coco Chanel reportedly spent too much time on a yacht and came back with a sunburn. Because she was Chanel, everyone decided that a tan was now the ultimate sign of leisure. It meant you had the money to travel to the south of France or the Caribbean. Suddenly, the lead-white powders were thrown out, and sunbathing became the new obsession. People who had spent centuries hiding under parasols were now slathering themselves in baby oil and frying in the sun. It was a 180-degree flip in the definition of status. As we move into the 1930s and 40s, beauty became a patriotic duty. During the war, Rosie the Riveter needed to look capable but also feminine. Red lipstick became a symbol of defiance against the drabness of conflict. Even when there were shortages of stockings, women didn't give up. They used liquid stockings, essentially tan paint, and had their friends draw a seam down the back of their legs with an eyeliner pencil. Imagine the patience of standing perfectly still while your sister draws a straight line from your heel to your thigh, just to give the illusion of silk. It was a world of make do and mend, where beauty was a way to keep up morale. And let's not forget the beauty calibrator, another Max Factor invention from the 30s. It was a terrifying-looking metal cage that fit over a woman's head with dozens of tiny screws to measure the symmetry of her face. It looked like a medieval torture device, but its purpose was to find flaws so they could be corrected with contouring. This was the beginning of the idea that a face could be corrected with geometry. We see the echoes of that today in every social media filter. We are still living in the world Max Factor built, a world where beauty is a math problem to be solved with a brush. As the 1950s arrived, the new look brought back the corset in the form of the wasp waist and the bullet bra. We went from the flat-chested flapper back to the exaggerated atomic silhouette. It was a time of stiff petticoats, matching shoes, and hair that was sprayed with so much lacquer it could withstand a hurricane. The natural look was dead again. To be a woman in the 50s was to be a highly polished, perfectly coiffed, and very colorful version of a human. It was the era of the housewife superstar, where you were expected to vacuum the rug in high heels and pearls. As you lie there, think about the smell of this era. It isn't wood smoke and lavender anymore. It's hairspray, cigarette smoke, and heavy floral perfumes like Chanel No. 5. It's the smell of a department store makeup counter. The world has become faster, brighter, and louder. But underneath it all, the same old drive remained. The desire to fit a mold, to be correct, to be seen. The stories of the lead-poisoned queens and the arsenic-eating Victorians feel like a long time ago, but the early 20th century shows us that we never really stopped being weird about beauty. We just changed our tools. We traded the leeches for electric permanent wave machines. We traded the lead for sun lamps. We are still the same creatures trying to decorate ourselves in the dark. But tonight, the machines are all unplugged. The hairspray has settled, the liquid stockings have been washed away, the movie screens are dark, and the starlets are all asleep. The history of beauty is a long, exhausting race, but you don't have to run it anymore. You are back in the quiet, back in the stillness. There are no beauty calibrators here, no binders, no cages. There is just the soft, rhythmic sound of the modern world finally going to sleep. The 20th century was loud and bright, but even its neon lights eventually dim. The future is waiting, but for now, the past is just a soft echo. Sleep now, knowing that for all the changes in history, the most beautiful thing a human can do is finally, simply, close their eyes and rest.